The moment James Keating heard those words drift through the dusty air of Caldwell's general store, something inside his chest cracked open like drought-hardened earth meeting the first rain of spring, and he knew with absolute certainty that he was not going to walk out of that store and leave this woman behind. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Redemption, Kansas sat along the edge of the Kishom Trail like a battered coin dropped in the dirt, small, roughed up, but still holding its value for those who knew where to look. The Santa Fe Railroad had pushed through the territory just a year prior, and with it came a flood of settlers, speculators, gamblers, and dreamers, all chasing some version of a life they had built entirely in their imaginations. Redemption had a livery stable, a barbershop, a two-room schoolhouse, a saloon that never seemed to close, and Caldwell's general store, which served as the beating heart of commerce and gossip for every soul within 40 miles. James had ridden into town that morning for the same reason. He always did: supplies. He needed salt, dried beans, a new length of rope, and maybe a sack of coffee if old Harold Caldwell had managed to restock his shelves since the last shipment. James worked cattle for the Double Arrow Ranch, a decent operation about 12 miles southwest of Redemption, owned by a man named Fletcher Bain, who was stern but fair and paid his hands on time. James was 28 years old, broad in the shoulder, quiet in the way of men who had spent more years talking to cattle and horses than to other people, and he had a face that was weathered from years of open sky, not old, but lived in, the kind of face that told you this man had seen hardship and had not been broken by it. He had tied his horse, a buckskin gelding named Copperhead, to the post outside and pushed through the door of Caldwell's store, which smelled the way all such stores smelled in that era: flour and leather and coal oil, and the faint sweetness of hard candy, kept in a glass jar near the counter. Harold Caldwell was behind the counter, a stout man in his mid-50s with a waxed mustache and spectacles that perpetually slid to the end of his nose. And at the counter, speaking in a voice so low that James almost did not catch it, was a woman. He had not noticed her right away. He had moved toward the shelving along the left wall, reaching for the coffee, his eyes scanning the tin cans and flour sacks with practiced efficiency. But then her voice reached him, barely above a whisper, threaded through with a dignity that was doing its absolute best to hold together under enormous strain. "Mr. Caldwell, I know I still owe on the account, and I am sorry for it. But I only wondered if perhaps there was any work I could do. Sweeping, sorting, anything. I have not eaten in 2 days, and I find myself without options." James went very still. He did not turn around immediately. He stood with his hand on a can of coffee, and he listened, because something in those words had the quality of a bell struck clean and true. It rang through the noise of everything else and hit him somewhere below the ribs. Harold Caldwell cleared his throat, and James could hear the man's discomfort even from across the store. "Now, Miss Chandler, I'm not running a charity establishment here. Your account is already at $4.30, which is—" "I understand," the woman said, and her voice did not crack, though James would later marvel at the effort it must have cost her. "I understand completely. I am sorry to have asked." James set the coffee can down on the shelf, turned around, and got his first real look at Eudora Chandler. She was perhaps 24, though the exhaustion in her face made it difficult to say for certain. She was tall for a woman of that era, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a hat that had seen better days, and she wore a dress that was clean but faded past any original color into something between gray and brown. Her eyes were hazel, large and steady, and they were currently fixed on Harold Caldwell with an expression of quiet endurance that made James feel something shift permanently inside him. She was not weeping. She was not pleading. She had asked, been refused, and was already accepting it, and that composed dignity in the face of what was clearly desperate hunger struck him harder than anything had struck him in a very long time. He crossed the store in 4 strides. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, setting his hat on the counter, I will be needing those beans, the salt, the rope, and the coffee today. And I will also be needing a meal's worth of provisions." He pulled out his coin purse and laid it on the counter. "Whatever a good supper would call for, bread or biscuit fixings, some salt pork if you have it, perhaps some dried apple." Harold blinked at him over his spectacles. "James Keating, since when do you need?" "Since right now," James said simply, and there was something in his tone that settled the matter. He did not look directly at the woman beside him yet. He waited while Harold, grumbling but moving, began assembling the order. Then he gathered everything into 2 parcels, his own supplies in one, and the food items in another, and he set the second parcel on the counter in front of Eudora Chandler. She stared at it. Then she looked up at him, and James met her eyes, and he found that holding her gaze was not difficult at all. It felt, in fact, like something he had been practicing for without knowing it. "You did not have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I wanted to." She looked at the parcel, then back at him, and he could see her working through the calculations of pride and need that every person in genuine hardship must navigate. Then she reached out and picked up the parcel, and she nodded once, a small, precise movement that carried more gravity than a lengthy speech. "Thank you," she said. "I am Eudora Chandler." "James Keating," he said. He picked up his own supplies and his hat. Are you staying nearby? I could carry that if it would help." "I am staying at Mrs. Hobbs's boarding house," she said, "temporarily." The word temporarily told him a great deal. He nodded. "I will walk you if you do not mind." She considered him for a moment with those steady hazel eyes, and he let her look, because he understood that a woman alone in a frontier town had every right to be cautious about accepting company from a stranger. Then she said, "All right, Mr. Keating. I do not mind." They walked out into the October sunlight together, James leading Copperhead by the reins, and the town of Redemption continued about its business entirely unaware that something had just begun that would outlast every cattle drive, every drought, and every winter that followed. Mrs. Hobbs's boarding house was a narrow 2-story building at the far end of Main Street, its white paint peeling at the corners and its front porch tilted slightly to one side. But it was clean, and its proprietress, a widow in her 60s named Constance Hobbs, ran it with the firm and efficient hand of a woman who had survived a great deal and intended to survive more. James learned, walking beside Eudora the length of the town's dusty Main Street, that Eudora had arrived in Redemption 3 weeks prior from St. Louis, Missouri, having traveled by rail to Dodge City and then by stagecoach the remaining distance south. "What brought you to Redemption?" he asked, because he genuinely wanted to know, and because he was a man who preferred honest questions to careful circling. Eudora was quiet for a moment. The sun was warm on the side of his face, and the wind carried the smell of dry grass and distance. "My father passed away in July," she said. "He had debts I was not aware of. The house in St. Louis was sold to settle them. I had very little, and I had a letter from an old family acquaintance who had relocated to this territory, suggesting there might be work here." She paused. "The acquaintance had moved on by the time I arrived. There is no work here that a woman without connections or capital can easily find. I have been looking." "What sort of work did you do in St. Louis?" he asked. "I kept the accounts for my father's hardware business," she said. "I can read, write, and do figures. I can sew. I can cook." She glanced at him sideways with a faint, dry humor that surprised him and delighted him in equal measure. "I am apparently quite good at going hungry, as it turns out." He laughed. It was a short sound, but it was real, and she seemed slightly startled by it, as though she had not expected it, and then the corner of her own mouth turned up. They reached Mrs. Hobbs's porch, and Eudora turned to face him. She held the parcel against her chest and looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. It was something between gratitude and something more complicated, something that involved seeing him clearly. "You are not from Redemption either," she said, not a question. "No," he said, "Texas originally. I have been working the Double Arrow Ranch for 3 years." He held his hat in his hand, turning it slowly by the brim. "It is decent enough work. The land out here is good land once you learn to read it." "Do you like it?" she asked. "This life?" He thought about it seriously before answering because it was a serious question. "I like the work," he said. "I like the cattle and I like the open country. I find I am less certain about the rest of it, the solitary parts." She nodded slowly as though she understood that perfectly. "Will you eat something now?" he said. "You should eat. You can if you want company while you do. I have no pressing need to be anywhere before nightfall." She tilted her head. "You rode 12 miles to buy supplies and now you have no pressing need to be anywhere." "The supplies will keep," he said, "and so will the ranch." She studied him a moment longer, and then she opened the door to Mrs. Hobbs's boarding house and held it so he could follow. Mrs. Hobbs's kitchen was warm and smelled of wood smoke and old bread, and when Eudora explained the contents of the parcel, the landlady, who regarded James with the sharp professional assessment of a woman who had housed many cowboys and was perfectly capable of identifying the decent ones, agreed to heat the salt pork and make up some biscuits with the fixings. She set them at the small table in the kitchen and then made a pointed show of having laundry to see to in the next room, which gave them privacy without impropriety. Eudora ate with the contained, careful grace of someone who was extremely hungry and determined not to show it. James had seen hunger before. He had been hungry himself during lean stretches between ranching jobs in his younger years, and he recognized the particular discipline of it, the way you chewed slowly not for enjoyment, but to make your body believe there was more coming than there was. He did not draw attention to it. He talked instead easily about the ranch and the cattle and a particularly stubborn longhorn steer that had escaped its pasture 4 times in a month, and she listened and asked questions, and after a while he saw the tension leave her shoulders by degrees, like snow melting. When she had finished eating and wrapped her hands around a cup of coffee that Mrs. Hobbs had wordlessly produced, the color was better in her face and her eyes were clearer, and James felt something settle in his own chest, satisfied and warm. "I want to help," he said, setting down his own cup. "If there is a way I would like to." She looked at him across the table. "Why?" she asked, and it was not an ungrateful question, it was a genuine one, asked by a woman who needed to understand the nature of a gift before she could accept it fully. "Because you needed help," he said, "and because you asked for it the right way with dignity, without manipulation, without dramatics. That is rarer than it ought to be." He paused. "And because I think you are the most interesting person I have encountered in 3 years in this territory, and I would like to keep talking to you." She was quiet for a moment, and 2 spots of color appeared in her cheeks that had nothing to do with warmth or hunger. "That is remarkably honest," she said. "I have found that honesty is more efficient than the alternative," he said. She looked at her coffee cup and then back at him. "What kind of help did you have in mind, Mr. Keating?" "There is a woman in town," he said, "Ruth Parrish. She runs the millinery shop 2 streets over. Her husband left in the spring, headed for the silver fields in Colorado, and she has been managing alone. I believe she would pay for help with the books if the books needed keeping, and they likely do. Ruth is a fine hat maker, but figures give her trouble." He paused. "I could introduce you, if you wanted." Eudora looked at him with an expression that was calculating but not unkind. "You have thought this through fairly quickly for a man who only learned my name 20 minutes ago." "I think quickly when something matters," he said. Another silence, and then she set down her coffee cup with a decisive little sound and looked at him with something new in her expression, something that was just beginning to be trust. "All right, Mr. Keating, take me to meet Ruth Parrish." He did that same afternoon, and the meeting was a success. Ruth Parrish was a businesslike, warm-hearted woman of 30 with a shop that smelled of ribbon and straw, and who had indeed been drowning in a chaos of invoices and credit accounts that she openly admitted she could not make sense of. When Eudora sat down with the ledger books and ran her eye down a column of figures and then looked up and said, without any particular triumph, that she had found 3 errors in the first page alone. Ruth hired her on the spot for room, board at Mrs. Hobbs's, and a small weekly wage. James watched Eudora's face in that moment, the moment she was told she had the work, and he saw relief move through her like light through water, rapid and complete, transforming everything it touched. She composed herself instantly, thanked Ruth with professional brevity, and then turned to James with an expression that was carefully controlled but not quite controlled enough to hide what was underneath it. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You earned it," he said. "You knew what you were looking at the moment you opened the ledger." She smiled then. A real one, the first full one he had seen. And he would think about this later, lying awake in his bunk at the Double Arrow while the wind worked at the walls. It was the kind of smile that rearranged the furniture of a man's interior life and made it very difficult to go back to the way things had been arranged before. He rode back to the Double Arrow that evening with his supplies lashed behind Copperhead's saddle, the last of the October sun laying long gold bars across the prairie grass, and he thought about Eudora Chandler the entire 12 miles home. Fletcher Bain noticed that James was distracted the following morning during the muster, which was the sort of thing a ranch foreman noticed and commented on, and by that afternoon 2 of the other hands, a young Mexican vaquero named Alejandro Cruz, and a leathery old-timer everyone called Dutch who had been driving cattle since before the war, had deduced from James's unusual quantity of staring at the middle distance that a woman was involved. "Who is she?" Alejandro asked, at supper. "Nobody's business," James said. "That is definitely a woman," Dutch said to Alejandro. James ate his beans and said nothing, but that Friday, when the hands had their half-day, he saddled Copperhead with rather more care than usual and rode to Redemption. Eudora was at the millinery shop when he arrived, seated at a small desk in the back room with the afternoon light falling across the ledger books she was working through, and when the door opened and she looked up and saw him, that composed, careful face did something interesting. It got softer briefly, before she caught herself. "Mr. Keating," she said. "Miss Chandler," he said, "I thought you might want to know how that steer I mentioned turned out. The one that escaped 4 times. 5 now," he said gravely. "He has become a matter of ranch legend." The corner of her mouth turned up. "Come in then," she said. "Ruth has gone to see about a shipment at the freight office. She left half a pot of coffee on the stove." They spent an hour and a half in that back room, talking, and James found that talking to Eudora Chandler was the conversational equivalent of riding a horse that matched your rhythm perfectly. There was an ease to it, a natural correspondence, and also the occasional unexpected turn that made the whole thing interesting. She had read widely. Her father had maintained a library and had believed, somewhat unusually for the era, that his daughter had as much right to education as any son might have had. She had opinions about things, clearly considered opinions, delivered without apology. When James said something she disagreed with, she said so, plainly and without sharpness, and then listened to his response with genuine attention. He had met very few people of either sex who could do both those things simultaneously, and he found it extraordinary. He came back the following Friday and the one after that. By the 3rd visit, Eudora had begun to expect him. She had not admitted this to anyone, including herself, but she had found on the Friday mornings that she woke up earlier than usual and was more careful than usual about her hair, and that the hours before midday passed slowly in a way that the hours after his arrival did not. On the 4th Friday, James brought her a book. It was a second-hand copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch, which he had found at the back of Caldwell's store tucked between a seed catalog and a farming almanac, and it was in reasonable condition, and he had paid 20 cents for it. He set it on her desk without ceremony while she was still writing in the ledger. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. "How did you know I would want this? You mentioned last week that you missed reading," he said, "and you mentioned George Eliot the week before that." She stared at the book for a moment longer, and when she looked up at him again, her hazel eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with lamplight. "James," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and they both heard it. "Yes," he said. "Thank you," she said softly. "I like making you happy," he said, and the words came out without any calculation, and they sat between them in the quiet of the back room of Ruth Parrish's millinery shop, absolutely plain and absolutely honest, and Eudora looked at them for a long moment and then looked at him and did not look away. November arrived, bringing with it the cold that the Kansas plains delivered with brisk indifference to human comfort, and with it came a development that complicated things considerably. Fletcher Bain, the owner of the Double Arrow Ranch, called James into the main house on a Tuesday evening, an unusual occurrence, and told him that he had been approached by a neighboring landowner named Gordon Trace about buying the southern quarter of the Double Arrow's acreage. Trace was a man of substantial resources and very little scruple, and he had been quietly acquiring land along the Kishom corridor for 2 years. Bain did not want to sell, but he was carrying debt from a rough previous winter, and the pressure Trace could apply through his connections with the county surveyor's office and certain officials in Dodge City meant that the matter was not as simple as Bain simply refusing. James listened to all of this and then said, "What do you need from me?" "I need someone I trust to ride to Dodge City and speak to our lawyer, a man named Aaron Whitfield. Whitfield has been dealing with the county assessor's records, and he believes there is a boundary discrepancy in Trace's survey claims that could be challenged legally." Bain leaned back in his chair. "I am telling you because you are the most reliable man I have, James, and because this will take 2 or 3 days and I want it done quietly." James thought of Redemption, 12 miles in the other direction from Dodge City. He thought of Fridays. He said, "I can leave Thursday." "Good man," Bain said. He rode to Redemption first on Wednesday afternoon because he was not willing to disappear for nearly a week without telling Eudora. He found her closing up the millinery shop for the day, wrapping her coat around herself in the early dark and cold of November. "I am going to Dodge City for the ranch," he told her, standing on the step of the shop. "I will be gone most of the week. I wanted you to know." She was quiet for a moment, buttoning the top button of her coat. "I see," she said, then carefully, "When will you be back?" "Saturday or Sunday," he said, "depending on the roads." She nodded and looked at the middle distance, which was the same thing he did when he was working something through, and he recognized it in her as he recognized it in himself. "Be careful on the road," she said. "It has been cold. The river crossings will be icy." "I know the roads," he said. "I know you know the roads," she said, and then looked directly at him, and her expression was not veiled at all in that moment. It was entirely open, and what he saw there made his heartbeat change its rhythm in a way he was not sure he had the words for. "I will simply feel better when you are back," she said. "That is all." He stood there for a moment looking at her in the cold November air, and then he did something that surprised them both. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of auburn hair back from her face, a gesture so simple and so gentle that it barely counted as contact, but that left them both very still for a second afterward. "I will be back Sunday," he said. He made it back Saturday. The road to Dodge City was 40 miles through open country that the November wind raked without mercy, and Copperhead was not fond of the cold but was reliable about it. Aaron Whitfield, the lawyer, was a thin, precise man who kept a tidy office and took careful notes, and who, after reviewing the documents James brought from Bain, said that he believed there was indeed a valid case to be made against Trace's survey claims, and that he would need 3 weeks to prepare the appropriate filings for the county court. This was good news, and James carried it back with some satisfaction, pushing Copperhead at a good pace on Saturday morning through the iron-gray weather, arriving in Redemption by midday. He did not go to the ranch first. He went to the millinery shop. Eudora was not there, Ruth told him, with a knowing look that James did not feel he had the leisure to be embarrassed by, that Eudora had taken the afternoon off and was likely at Mrs. Hobbs's. He found her there in the parlor, reading Middlemark by the window, wrapped in a quilt, and when he knocked on the parlor door and she looked up and saw him, she closed the book and stood up with a speed that was entirely unguarded. "You said Sunday," she said. "The roads were good," he said. She stood there looking at him for a moment, and then she crossed the room and quite simply put her hands on both sides of his face and looked at him, the way you look at something you thought you might lose and have not. Her hands were warm from the quilt and his face was cold from the November wind, and the contrast of it was extraordinarily vivid. "You are freezing," she said. "I rode fast," he said. "Foolish man," she said softly, but she was not letting go of his face. "Eudora," he said. "James," she said. He covered her hands with his own, both of them, and they stood there in the parlor of Mrs. Hobbs's boarding house in the gray November light, and then he said very quietly, "I thought about you the whole way there and the whole way back. I thought about you the whole time I was there, for that matter." "I thought about you too," she said. "Every single day." She paused. "I was frightened of the river crossings." "I was careful," he said. "I know," she said. "You are always careful." Then more quietly, "I am not accustomed to caring about someone's river crossings." "Neither am I," he said. He turned her hands in his and pressed them gently, and looked at her with everything he had been carrying since the day he heard her voice in Caldwell's store. "I am not a man of very much, Eudora. I have a good horse, a strong back, and wages enough to save something by. I am not certain I have a great deal to offer a woman who ought to have a great deal offered to her." "James," she said, with a kind of quiet precision that reminded him of the way she had corrected a column of figures on the first day in Ruth's shop, "I have spent the last 5 months discovering that what I had was no protection at all from the actual difficulties of living. I have come to believe that character is of considerably more practical value than capital." She looked at him steadily. "And your character, Mr. Keating, is the finest thing I have encountered in a very long time." He kissed her then, gently, "the way you do a thing you have been thinking about carefully enough that you want to do it right," and she kissed him back without hesitation. And outside the parlor window redemption, Kansas went about its business in the cold, and Mrs. Hobbs, who had absolutely been listening from the hallway, made a small sound of satisfaction and went to put a fresh pot of coffee on. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was a particularly fierce one on the Kansas plains, and redemption hunkered down against it with the pragmatic endurance of a town that had seen bad winters before and expected to see more. The snow came in December with a seriousness that blocked the roads for days at a stretch, and there were times when James could not make it to town at all, the drifts piling too high even for Copperhead's willing legs. During those weeks, Eudora wrote him letters, and he wrote back, and the exchange of those letters became something that they both looked forward to with a ferocity that somewhat startled them both. Her letters were intelligent and funny and occasionally achingly honest in ways that his, being by nature a man of fewer words, attempted to match. He described the ranch in winter, the way the snow transformed the landscape into something that looked entirely different from the grassland of warmer months, vast and still and pale. She described the millinery shop and Ruth's constant running commentary on the personal affairs of every person in redemption, which Eudora reported with dry, affectionate precision. She described the boarding house and Mrs. Hobbs's particular philosophy of life, which involved strong coffee, plain speaking, and the inadvisability of self-pity. She described in one letter a dream she had had about St. Louis, about her father's hardware shop and the smell of iron and sawdust, and there was grief in that letter that was honest and unornamented, and James read it twice and then wrote back about his own father, who had worked cattle in Texas and died of a fever when James was 17, and about how grief was the tax you paid for loving people, which was expensive but still worth the investment. She wrote back and said, "That is the truest thing I have read since Middlemark." He wrote back and said, "I thought about that line for 3 days before I put it in the letter." She wrote back and said, "That may be the most romantic thing you have ever told me." When January thawed enough for him to get to town, he rode to Redemption on a Friday afternoon with the sky a hard pale blue above the snow-flattened grass, and he went to the millinery shop, and he knocked, and Eudora opened the door, and they stood looking at each other for a moment with weeks of letters between them and now no letters necessary, only the actual fact of each other, and it was better. Better than the letters, better than the memory of the last time he had seen her, better in the way that the real thing is always better than the idea of it. "Come in out of the cold," she said, reaching for his coat, and he let her take it and hung his hat on the peg, and they went into the back room where the stove was going. It was over coffee in that back room, on a bitter January afternoon with the wind pressing itself against the glass of the one small window, that James said, "I want to ask you something important." Eudora wrapped her hands around her cup and looked at him. "Then ask it," she said. "I intend to," he said. He set down his own cup. He was a man who did not often feel unsteady, but he felt it now, not unpleasantly, but the way you feel at the edge of something real and significant. "I am going to speak to Fletcher Bain about my wages. I have been saving well, and I am thinking about land. Small parcel, nothing dramatic, but something to call my own. There is a section a few miles northeast of the Double Arrow that Bain has mentioned might come available in the spring. A small house on it. Needs work but sound." He paused. "I want to ask if you would consider if you would be willing to—" "Yes," she said. He blinked. "I have not finished asking." "You are asking me to marry you," she said without drama, "and the answer is yes." He looked at her. "How certain are you of that?" "James," she said, with the particular mixture of fondness and exasperation that he had come to understand was her version of deep affection, "I have been certain of that since November. I have simply been waiting for you to catch up." He laughed, a full one, the kind that filled the room, and reached across the small table and took her hand, and she turned it over in his grip and laced her fingers through his, and outside the window the Kansas winter went on being severe and indifferent, and inside the back room of Ruth Parrish's millinery shop, James Keating and Eudora Chandler were warm. He spoke to Fletcher Bain the following week. The land situation had resolved satisfactorily. Aaron Whitfield had filed the necessary documents in Dodge City's county court in December, and the boundary dispute against Gordon Trace's survey claims had been sustained by the court commissioner, who had reviewed the original territorial survey records and confirmed that Trace's claimed boundary encroached on Double Arrow property. Trace had made several threats of the blustering, self-important variety before backing down, and now Bain was in a better position than he had been in months, which meant he was in an expansive mood when James sat down with him. James explained his intentions, including the land, the house, and Eudora, in the clear and direct manner that was his natural mode of communication. Bain listened without interrupting, which was how you knew he was paying serious attention. "Chandler," Bain said, "the woman who does Ruth Parrish's accounts." "Yes." "I have heard good things," Bain said. He stroked his jaw. "The section you are talking about northeast of my south pasture, old Hector Avery's original homestead claim. His widow has been trying to sell it since he died. The house is small but Avery built sound. About 80 acres. He looked at James steadily. "I can write you a reference for the bank in Dodge City. With your savings and a reasonable loan you might make the purchase. And James," he paused, "I will give you the first month without docking your wage, to get settled." James shook his hand. "I am grateful to you." "I am grateful to you," Bain said. "You saved this ranch this past fall. Get yourself some land and a good woman and come back and work for me half-time while you build up your own herd. We can make an arrangement." This was, all considered, more than James had hoped for, and he rode back to Redemption that same afternoon and told Eudora all of it while they walked along the main street in the pale winter sun, their breath clouding the air, her hand on his arm. She listened to all of it with her characteristic attention, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment. 80 acres, she said. "To start," he said. "It is not much, but "It is real," she said, and the word real was the most important word in the sentence, said with the weight of a woman who had spent several months discovering the value of things that were real against things that were merely assumed. "It is real land and a real house and a real life." She paused. "I can keep accounts. If there are other ranchers in the area who need bookkeeping done, I can build a small clientele. Ruth will give me a recommendation." "I know you can," he said. "I am not worried about that." "I know you are not," she said. "I am telling you my plans," he smiled. "Tell me all of them." She did, walking the length of Redemption's main street and back again in the January cold, her voice precise and animated as she described what she envisioned, not extravagant, not fanciful, but clear and practical and full of the specific, detailed intelligence she brought to everything she considered. A kitchen garden in the spring, a proper desk for the accounts work, a shelf for books. Chickens eventually, once the place was set to rights. "Chickens," he said. "Everyone needs chickens," she said firmly. "Yes, they do," he agreed. They were married in March of 1879, on a Thursday, at the small white church at the edge of Redemption that had been built 2 years prior by the local congregation, and was presided over by a minister named Reverend Thomas Graves, who was a compact, serious man with a warm handshake and a good speaking voice. The ceremony was attended by Ruth Parrish, who wept openly and happily, by Mrs. Hobbs, who did not weep but gripped Eudora's hand very firmly before the service and said, "You have chosen well, girl," by Fletcher Bain and his wife, Martha, who had driven in from the Double Arrow, by Alejandro Cruz and Dutch from the ranch crew, and by a handful of Redemption townspeople who had come to know and like Eudora in the months she had lived and worked there. It was a simple service, because they were both people who preferred the real over the ornamental, and when Reverend Graves asked James if he took this woman and James said yes, he looked at Eudora while he said it, not at the Reverend, and Eudora looked back at him with those steady hazel eyes that were bright and clear and unguarded, and she said yes too, with the same directness she brought to everything, and the congregation of Redemption, Kansas, witnessed two people who meant every word. Ruth had made Eudora a small bouquet of dried flowers and ribbon, which was the best the season offered, and Eudora held it carefully throughout the ceremony and set it on the mantelpiece of the Avery farmhouse afterward, where it stayed for years. The Avery farmhouse, which they had taken to calling simply the Keating place, was indeed in need of work but was fundamentally sound, as Bain had promised. Avery had built with good timber and careful joints, and the main room was larger than it looked from the outside, with a fireplace at the center and two south-facing windows that let in the afternoon light beautifully. There were 2 rooms beyond the main, one a bedroom, and a smaller room that Eudora claimed immediately as her office, and that James accepted with the equanimity of a man who had known from the beginning exactly what he was taking on. They spent the first weeks of their marriage working on the house together, which was an excellent way, James discovered, to learn a great deal about a person very quickly. Eudora was not squeamish about work. She wielded a paintbrush with the same precision she brought to a column of figures. She was decisive about arrangement and placement, and she had strong opinions about the kitchen, all of which were correct. James repaired the porch, patched the roof, replaced 2 rotted window frames, and built a new set of shelves in Eudora's office with lumber from the mill in town. When he was done, she filled those shelves with her small collection of books and ran her fingers along them in a gesture that was so privately happy that he felt honored to have witnessed it. The spring came early and well that year, the prairie greening with a speed that seemed almost urgent, the sky opening up to that enormous, impossible blue that the plains produced in April when the weather was being cooperative. Eudora planted her kitchen garden. She was methodical about it, row by row, with stakes and string to keep things orderly, and James began building up the small cattle operation that would eventually become their own herd, starting with 6 head purchased from Fletcher Bain at a fair price and a young horse, a gray mare he bought from a settler passing through. The bookkeeping work grew, as Eudora had predicted it would. Within 3 months of the marriage, she had 4 clients besides Ruth Parrish, 2 other redemption merchants, one of the larger ranches east of town, and Aaron Whitfield, the lawyer in Dodge City, who had been referred to her by Bain and who corresponded with her by mail, and was extremely satisfied with the quality and reliability of her work. She set up her desk in the office room and worked in the mornings while James was out with the cattle, and in the evenings they sat together by the fire, he mending harness or reading the newspaper that came out of Dodge City twice a week, she with her books or her correspondence. And those evenings were, James thought, the best hours of his adult life. He was not a man who said that kind of thing casually or without examination. He had turned it over and looked at it from several angles, the way he looked at a piece of ground he was considering buying, and it held up to examination every time. There was something about the specific combination of Eudora's company and their own particular life in that house on those 80 acres that constituted a kind of fullness he had not known he was missing until he found it. She made him laugh more than anyone had. She challenged him intellectually in ways that he found genuinely invigorating. And she loved him with a steady, unornamented certainty that was the most reassuring thing he had ever encountered, because it was the same kind of love he gave back to her, and they recognized each other in it. In the summer of 1879, the Gordon Trace situation briefly reasserted itself in an unpleasant way. Trace, having failed to acquire the Double Arrow land through legal means, had taken to making life difficult for smaller landholders in the area through various means, disputing water rights at shared creek access points, having county officials perform what seemed like suspiciously selective compliance inspections, and allegedly running cattle across neighboring property lines in a way that was technically difficult to prove. James was not immune to this, as his land abutted the same creek system that Trace had been contesting with Bain, and one August morning he discovered his fence along the creekside pasture had been cut. He repaired the fence without much public comment, because he was a man who did not lead with anger. But he rode to Redemption and spoke to the county sheriff, a man named Aldous Prentice who was honest but politically cautious, and not particularly eager to make an enemy of a man with Trace's resources. Prentice listened, wrote things down, and promised to look into it, which James understood to mean that the official route was going to be slow and uncertain. Eudora, when he told her that evening, thought about it for a while and then said, "Who does Gordon Trace answer to? Not locally higher up. Who holds his notes at the bank? Who supplied his initial investment capital?" James blinked. "I do not know. I think it would be worth finding out," she said. "A man like that always has someone he owes something to. If we can find out who that is, and if Aaron Whitfield can establish any pattern of deliberate interference with neighboring landholders, then the complaint does not have to go to Sheriff Prentice at all. It can go to the district court in Topeka." She paused. "Write to Whitfield." James wrote to Whitfield. Whitfield, who had by this point formed a high professional opinion of Eudora, wrote back with enthusiasm and a list of questions. Eudora helped James compile the answers over 3 evenings, cross-referencing information from 4 different sources, including the county recorder's public filings, which she had found in a bound volume at the Dodge City Courthouse on a trip she and James had made there in June for other purposes. The resulting document, which Whitfield submitted to the district court in September, named 3 separate instances of documented interference by Trace's operation against neighboring landholders and requested an official inquiry. Trace backed off. Not immediately, and not with anything resembling grace, but by October his interference with the creekside fence had stopped, the suspicious compliance inspections had ceased, and word came through Redemption's reliable gossip network that his principal backer in Kansas City was unhappy about the legal attention. Gordon Trace continued to be a powerful and unpleasant presence in the region for years afterward, but he did not trouble the Keating land again, and James attributed this entirely to Eudora's instinct to go for the structural problem rather than the surface symptom. "You think like a lawyer," he told her. "I think like an accountant," she said. Which is the same thing but less expensive. The summer of 1879 also brought something else, which was that Eudora began to suspect, and then to know, that she was with child. She told James on a Tuesday evening in late August, standing in the kitchen with the supper dishes still in the basin and the evening light coming through the window at a long gold angle, and she told him in the same direct way she told him everything, without preamble or decoration. He put down the towel he was holding and looked at her, and then he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his arms around her very carefully, as though she were made of something that required particular care, and he held her like that for a long time without saying anything. "Say something," she said, muffled against his shoulder. "I am saying something," he said. "It is just not in words." She laughed against his shirt, and he held her tighter, and the kitchen smelled of supper and wood smoke, and the summer evening coming through the open window, and he thought that this was the kind of moment that a man put in the locked room of his heart and kept there his whole life. The pregnancy was straightforward, if uncomfortable in the way that pregnancies in the latter months always were, and Eudora, being Eudora, continued her bookkeeping work until December and then reduced it only slightly, on the grounds that figures did not care whether she was with child, and she saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Mrs. Hobbs came out from town once a week during the winter to check on things, declaring that she had a vested interest in the matter because she had been the one who first gave them privacy to talk, and therefore bore some responsibility for what followed. Eudora received these visits with affection, and James received them with gratitude. The baby was born in April of 1880, a boy, in the bedroom of the farmhouse with a local midwife named Clara Dawson attending, who was brisk and competent, and who had delivered more than half of the children in the county, and had strong views about the importance of fathers waiting in the main room and not making a nuisance of themselves by hovering. James waited in the main room. He sat in his chair by the fireplace and turned his hat in his hands, and listened to the sounds from the bedroom, with the particular focused anxiety of a man who loves someone completely, and cannot do anything useful at the present moment, which is one of the more difficult conditions a competent person can be placed in. When Clara Dawson came out and said, "You have a son, Mr. Keating, and your wife is well and annoyed at me for not letting her get up yet," James felt something move through him that he had no precise vocabulary for, a compound feeling, enormous and warm, that involved every good thing simultaneously. They named the boy William, after James's father. William Thomas Keating arrived in the world with a full head of dark auburn hair that was clearly his mother's, and a serious expression that those who knew both parents agreed was entirely characteristic. Eudora, once Clara Dawson allowed it, was sitting up in bed with William when James came in, and she looked at him over the baby's head with that expression he loved best, the completely unguarded one, the one that was only for him, and she said, "Come and meet your son." He sat on the edge of the bed and she put William in his arms, and James held his son for the first time and looked down at this new person, this entire new person who had not existed until today. And he understood in a very deep and wordless way why people built things, why they planted gardens and repaired fences and filed documents with courts and kept good faith and worked toward tomorrow. Because all of that was, at its root, about making a world in which this small, serious-faced, auburn-haired William could grow. He looked up from the baby to Eudora, and she was watching him with eyes that were tired and shining and completely content. "You are a good man, James Keating," she said softly. "You made me better," he said. "We made each other better," she corrected, firmly but kindly, because she was always exact, and he loved her for it. The years that followed were full in the best sense of the word. James's cattle operation grew steadily because he was a careful buyer and a patient rancher, and the land turned out to be well suited to the enterprise. He continued to work part-time for the Double Arrow, as he and Bain had arranged, and the relationship between the two properties was one of practical mutual benefit that suited both men. By 1882, the Keating herd numbered 45 head, and James had taken on a young hand named Peter Reeves, a 17-year-old who had arrived in Redemption on foot and without much to his name, and who reminded James, in certain ways, of himself at that age, or perhaps of what he knew Eudora had been at 24 in Caldwell's store. He gave Peter work, board in the small bunkroom he had added to the back of the barn, and regular wages, and Peter proved to be one of those people who, when given a genuine chance, exceeded every reasonable expectation. Eudora's bookkeeping practice had, by 1882, expanded to 8 regular clients, including 3 ranching operations and Redemption's newly opened land registry office, which employed her 2 mornings a week as an official record keeper, a position that had been created specifically because the county needed someone with her skills and reliability, and which came with a small official salary, and the distinction of being one of the first women in that county to hold a paid governmental position. There had been some discussion about whether this was appropriate, and some of that discussion had been pointed and unpleasant, and Eudora had addressed it the way she addressed all things that attempted to reduce her, with complete composure and the straightforward presentation of her qualifications, which were irrefutable. The county hired her. She did the job superbly. The discussion stopped. Ruth Parrish, who had become one of their closest friends in those years, used to say that watching Eudora Chandler Keating navigate the world was like watching a particularly elegant piece of machinery, everything moving exactly as it ought to, with precision and without waste. James, who heard this reported to him by Eudora, said that he thought it was the finest compliment a person could receive. Eudora said she thought it made her sound like a cotton gin. They argued about this cheerfully for 20 minutes, which was the way their best conversations often went. In the spring of 1883, they had a second child, another boy, whom they named Robert Fletcher, the middle name being a tribute to Bain, who was touched by it in the way of a man who was not accustomed to being touched by things, and was therefore somewhat at a loss when it happened. Robert arrived with blue eyes that eventually turned gray, and a temperament that was sunny and sociable from the first, entirely unlike his serious-faced older brother, and entirely unlike either of his parents, which made him something of a delightful mystery. William, who was 3 when Robert was born, regarded his brother with the careful, considered suspicion of a serious-minded child confronted with an irrationally cheerful one, and then, over a period of about 2 weeks, decided that he approved and became Robert's devoted protector from that point forward, a role he took on with the particular solemnity of a boy who had clearly inherited his mother's sense of thoroughness. James watched his sons grow the way he watched his cattle and his land with a quiet, steady satisfaction, attentive to the particulars, grateful for the whole. He had not expected, at 28, listening to a woman's exhausted voice in Caldwell's store on an October morning, that the chain of decisions set in motion by that morning would lead here, to this house, this woman, these boys, this life. He was not a man who spent much time on what might have been. But occasionally, usually in the evenings when the boys were in bed, and he and Eudora sat together by the fire in the way that had been their habit since the beginning, he would look across at her, absorbed in a book, or the accounts, or occasionally simply looking into the fire with that private, intelligent expression. And he would feel the full weight of how close he had come to simply buying his coffee and walking out that day, and the feeling that accompanied this was something between vertigo and profound gratitude. One evening in the fall of 1883, he told her this. He was not usually so forthcoming about the interior landscape of his past, but the fire was warm and the boys were asleep and the day had been good and he felt the fullness of it pressing toward expression. "I nearly did not stop," he said, "in Caldwell's store, that first day." She looked up from her book. "What do you mean?" "I nearly just took my coffee and went," he said. "I heard you. I heard what you said to Harold Caldwell. And for a moment I just stood there, and I was aware that it would be much easier to not be involved, and that getting involved with a stranger's difficulties was not my ordinary practice." And he stopped. "And," she said. "And I could not do it," he said. "I could not walk out and leave you there." She was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the Kansas night was large and full of stars. "I am very glad you could not," she said softly. "So am I," he said. She put her book down and looked at him in the firelight with those hazel eyes that he knew as well as his own hands, and she said, "Do you know what I thought that first moment I saw you cross the store?" "What did you think?" "I thought, this is either a very kind man or a very foolish one," she said. "And then I thought, either way something is about to change." He smiled. "And was I kind or foolish?" "Both," she said, "in exactly the right proportion." He laughed, and she laughed with him, and then she picked up her book again. But she moved from her chair to the settee where he was sitting, and tucked herself against his side in the easy, accustomed way of two people who had been doing this for years. And he put his arm around her, and they sat like that in the firelight while the autumn wind moved around the house, and the boys slept soundly in the bedroom, and the Keating land stretched out in the dark around them. 80 acres of real ground that was theirs. The winter of 1883 brought a development they had not anticipated, which was that Harold Caldwell, aging and in poor health, announced his intention to sell Caldwell's General Store and retire to live with his daughter in Topeka. This created a problem for redemption, which depended on the store in the manner of all frontier towns depending on their main supply point, and it created a conversation in the community about who might take over the business. Ruth Parrish came to supper one evening and mentioned, over the table while William ate his beans with studied concentration and Robert attempted to feed his portion to the dog, that the store was going to need a proprietor who understood inventory, credit accounts, and community relationships. She looked at Eudora while saying this in a way that was not subtle at all. "I am listening," Eudora said. "The building comes with the business," Ruth said. "Harold is asking a fair price and he will owner finance a portion of it to the right buyer." Eudora looked at James across the table. He read her expression and said, "Tell me the numbers." They spent 3 evenings working through the numbers. Sales figures from the store's public account history that Eudora had access to through the land registry's commercial records. The asking price. The terms of Harold's offered financing, projected operating costs, and the question of whether the Keating household could sustain 2 business operations simultaneously while also running the cattle. It was a complex puzzle and they worked it together, which was how they approached every significant problem. And at the end of the 3rd evening, Eudora put down her pen and said, "It is feasible. Not comfortable, but feasible, and the upside is substantial if we manage it correctly." "It would be your operation to run," James said. "I cannot give it more than part-time with the cattle and the ranch work." "I know that," she said. "I am not asking you to. I am asking whether you think it is a sound investment." He considered. "I think," he said, "that any business in redemption that you are running is a sound investment." She bought Caldwell's General Store in January of 1884. Negotiating the final terms herself in a meeting with Harold Caldwell that she reported to James afterward, with a controlled but evident satisfaction. Harold Caldwell, who had regarded her with considerable skepticism the day she had stood at his counter and asked for work, shook her hand at the conclusion of the deal and said that he hoped she would run it better than he had. Eudora said that she intended to, and Harold Caldwell laughed and said that he believed her. She renamed it Keating's Mercantile, and she ran it with the same methodical intelligence and clear-eyed practicality she brought to everything. She reorganized the inventory, updated the credit account system, and established a regular ordering schedule with the freight company that reduced the frequency of the stockouts that had periodically frustrated the town under Caldwell's management. She hired 2 part-time assistants, a young woman named Abigail Hayes and an older man, a freedman named Joseph Coles who had come north from Texas in the trail migration, and who proved to be both reliable and extraordinarily good with customers. The store became, under Eudora's management, the thing that Caldwell's had always been in aspiration, but not quite in practice, the genuine heart of commerce and community for redemption, and its surrounding territory. She knew her customers' accounts and their needs. She stocked with attention to what people actually required rather than only what was easiest to source. And she gave credit with the careful judgment of someone who had herself once depended on the generosity of credit and understood both its value and its risks. James came in on Friday mornings. His Fridays had always been associated with going to redemption. This had not changed, and would sit on the counter at the back of the store and talk with her while she sorted invoices, which was a reversal of the original arrangement that they both found quietly funny. He would bring the boys when they were not in school, and William would immediately find something useful and helpful to do, and Robert would immediately find something enjoyable and probably inadvisable to do, and Eudora would manage all of it simultaneously without appearing to manage any of it, which James continued to find genuinely impressive. Ruth Parrish, whose millinery shop remained adjacent to the Mercantile in what had become a thriving little commercial block on Redemption's Main Street, was in the habit of dropping in for afternoon coffee, and these three, Ruth, Eudora, and whichever of the ranch men or town business people happened to be present, constituted the informal social nucleus of Redemption's public life in those years. Mrs. Hobbs, who was advancing in age but remained sharp and opinionated, visited regularly and occupied her usual seat near the stove with the authority of a natural institution. In the summer of 1885, James made the full transition away from wage work at the Double Arrow, having built the Keating cattle operation to a size that could sustain the household independently. Fletcher Bain, now in his 60s and thinking about his own eventual succession, had begun to involve his nephew in the ranch operations, and the arrangement with James had naturally wound down over the previous year. They parted on excellent terms, as they had conducted the entire relationship with straightforwardness and mutual respect. Bain and his wife Martha came to supper at the Keating place that summer, and the four of them sat on the repaired and expanded front porch James had built in the spring and watched the long Kansas evening settle across the grass, and it was comfortable in the way of people who have been through things together and come out better on the other side. "You have done well," Bain told James, looking out at the pasture where the Keating cattle stood dark shapes in the fading light. "We have done well," James said, and Eudora, who was refilling cups from the coffee pot, gave him the small particular smile that was exclusively his. The boys grew, as boys do, with speed that seemed slightly unreasonable to their parents. William, serious and methodical and remarkably good with figures. He had begun helping with the store accounts at 10 years old, and Eudora had discovered to her delight that he had an intuitive grasp of them. Was by 1887 a tall, thoughtful 12-year-old who spent his free time reading everything he could get his hands on and asking questions about the cattle operation with a professional interest that made James think, with a mix of pride and wistfulness, that William would make his own choices, and they would be good ones. Robert, cheerful and athletic and constitutionally unable to be still for more than 10 minutes, was 9 years old and had already decided that he intended to be a cowboy of the most traditional variety, meaning he spent every possible moment on horseback and could not imagine a better life than the one his father had had. James occasionally pointed out that his father had spent a significant portion of that life being cold, tired, and underpaid, and Robert would listen politely and then go back to the horse. In the fall of 1887, Eudora discovered she was with child a third time, which surprised them both in the pleasant way of something you had not expected but were entirely glad of. She was 33 years old, and she told James in the same direct way she had told him the first time, standing in the kitchen, matter of fact, watching his face. He responded in the same way. He crossed the room and held her carefully. "You always hold me like I am going to break," she said, muffled against his shoulder. "I am not going to break, James." "I know you are not," he said. "I just like holding you." She laughed and held him back. The third child was born in the spring of 1888, on a warm April morning when the prairie was coming green, and the kitchen garden was just beginning to show its first shoots. And this time it was a girl. They named her Frances Ann, for Eudora's mother, and she arrived in the world with James's gray eyes and Eudora's auburn hair, and the immediately apparent combination of both parents' most characteristic qualities. The father's steadiness and the mother's precision, wrapped in a small person who regarded the world from her first days with a composed and measuring gaze. William, 12, received his sister with the grave seriousness he brought to all important matters, and appointed himself her unofficial guardian, a role he would maintain for the rest of his life. Robert, 8, was initially disappointed that it was not a boy, and then Frances fixed him with those gray eyes at the age of about 3 months, and something happened to Robert Keating at that moment that permanently rearranged his understanding of things, and he became her most devoted champion. The Keating family, which had begun with 2 people in a back room over coffee in a bitter January cold, was now 5, settled on 80 acres of good Kansas land with a sound house and a productive cattle operation, and a mercantile at the center of a growing town, and all of it rooted in the particular morning in October 1878, when James Keating had heard a woman's exhausted voice ask for help with a dignity that stopped him in his tracks. Redemption had grown in those years. The population that had been perhaps 200 in 1878 was closer to 600 by the end of the 1880s, and with it had come a new schoolhouse built in 1882, with a second classroom added in 1886, and a doctor's office occupied by a young physician named Dr. Samuel Ward, who had arrived fresh from his training in St. Louis, and who was, Ruth Parrish noted with considerable interest, unmarried and apparently unaware of this condition's remedies, which was a conversational subject she returned to with persistence for approximately 3 years before Ward and the schoolteacher, a Miss Clara Holt, sorted the matter out for themselves. The railroad's influence had continued to reshape the territory in those years. Prices for cattle had fluctuated with the cattle industry's larger patterns. The great trail drives from Texas were diminishing as the railroads extended further south and west, and the open range era was giving way to the fenced pasture era, which James had anticipated and prepared for by investing steadily in fence line and in the quality of his cattle rather than in quantity. By 1890, the Keating operation was smaller in head count than some of the larger ranches in the county, but produced per head returns that reflected better quality animals and better land management. And it was, James knew, the kind of operation that would sustain itself through the industry changes that were reshaping the West in those years. The summer of 1890 brought what James privately thought of as the settling of the last outstanding account, which was the final resolution of Eudora's sense of indebtedness to the past. She had never spoken of St. Louis much in those later years, but in June of that year a letter came from Missouri, from an attorney handling the estate of a distant Chandler relative who had died, and it informed Eudora that she was among several heirs to a modest bequest. The sum was not large, $300, but it was enough to clear the final balance on the mercantile's original purchase loan, which she had been repaying methodically since 1884. She came home that evening and set the letter on the kitchen table and told James about it while she made supper, and he watched her face as she spoke and saw something in it settle, something she might not have even known was still unsettled, some last remainder of the particular anxiety of a person who had once been genuinely without resources and who had never quite let go of the knowledge of how that felt. "We are clear," she said, meaning the loan. "We have been all right for a while. he said gently. I know, she said, but now we are clear. He understood the distinction. He came around the table and stood behind her where she was at the stove and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him, and he bent and pressed his mouth to her hair, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I am grateful every day. I want you to know that. So am I, he said. For Caldwell's store, she said, and the coffee and the fact that you did not walk out. You are worth not walking out for, he said simply. She turned around and looked up at him. And 12 years in the kitchen that was theirs, with 3 children who were theirs and 80 acres that were theirs and a life that was entirely and completely theirs, she looked at him the same way she had looked at him in January of 1879 in the back room of Ruth Parrish's millinery shop, with the winter outside and the stove going and the first full honesty of love between them. I love you, James Keating, she said. I love you, Eudora Keating, he said. I expect I will for the rest of my life and beyond it. Beyond it, she repeated thoughtfully. That is a significant commitment. I am a man of significant commitments, he said. She smiled, and he smiled, and then she turned back to the stove because supper would burn if it was not attended to, and James went to call the children in from outside, and the kitchen filled up with the noise and movement and cheerful ordinary chaos of a family at the end of a good day, and it was, as it had been for 12 years, and as it would be for many more, exactly what it should be. By the autumn of 1891, William was 16 and already apprenticing himself to the mercantile's accounts with a seriousness that made Eudora wonder, with the careful neutrality of a mother who did not want to impose her own preferences, whether he might someday want to study law or commerce. Robert, 13, had become an accomplished writer and had developed, much to his own surprise, a serious interest in the cattle breeding records that James kept, particularly the question of which bloodlines produced the best results on Kansas grass. Frances, 3 years old, had become a person of considerable presence for her size. She had her mother's precision with language already, and her father's habit of looking at things steadily until she understood them, and she had the additional quality of complete fearlessness, which was likely all her own. In October of that year, James and Eudora rode to Redemption together, as they often did on Saturday afternoons when Peter Reeves, who had been with them now for 9 years, a grown man with his own small savings and his own plans, could manage the ranch. They tied the horses in front of Keating's mercantile and went in, and Abigail Hayes, who had worked in the store for 7 years and managed it on the days Eudora was at the land registry or at the ranch, reported that the new dry goods shipment had come in, and there were no crises and everything was in order. Eudora went through the shipment with her characteristic efficiency, and James sat on the counter the way he always had, and they talked while she worked, about the cattle and the children and a new school reader that William wanted ordered, and about Ruth Parrish's millinery shop, which was expanding. She had recently taken on a partner, a young woman from the new wave of settlers who had genuine skill with the work. They talked about the land and the winter coming, and the question of whether the north pasture fence needed reinforcing before the cold set in. It was, as conversations went, entirely domestic and entirely unremarkable. And it was exactly the conversation that James would have chosen, given every option in the world, because it was the conversation of a man whose life was full in the specific, complete, well-founded way that had nothing to do with excess and everything to do with the right things in the right place. He watched Eudora make a note in the inventory ledger, her pen moving with the quick economy of long practice, and she looked up and caught him looking and raised an eyebrow. "Something on your mind," she said. "I was thinking," he said, "about a general store." She looked at him with that expression, the one that was fondness and sharpness in precisely the right mixture. "This one specifically, or general stores as a category?" "A specific one," he said. "In 1878 and a specific morning." Her expression softened. "James, you said that day," he said, "that you had not eaten in 2 days." "I did," she said quietly. "I have thought about that many times," he said. "The fact of it, that you had been that close to the edge and still managed to ask for what you needed with that kind of composure." He paused. "I thought about it because I think it is the thing I admire most about you. That you were in the hardest circumstances I can imagine, and you did not lose yourself in them. You stayed entirely who you are." Eudora was quiet for a moment, the pen in her hand, the ledger open on the counter, the October sunlight coming through the mercantile windows the same color it always was in that season, warm and particular. "I was barely holding myself together," she said honestly. "I know," he said. "That is what I mean. Barely holding together and still entirely yourself." He looked at her. "It is a rare thing." She put down the pen and came around the counter and stood in front of him where he sat on the counter's edge. And she put both hands on the sides of his face the way she had that day in November of 1878 when he had come back early from Dodge City and she had been reading Middlemark by the window. "You saved my life that day," she said. "I do not mean that dramatically. I mean it as a practical fact. I do not know what would have happened if you had walked out of that store without stopping." "I was not going to walk out," he said. "I know that now," she said. "I knew it then, actually, almost immediately, that you were not the kind of man who walked past something that needed attending to." She looked at him with those hazel eyes that he could read as easily as good print now, every shade of expression familiar and dear. "You attended to me, James. For 13 years you have attended to me. And I want you to know," she paused, and for a moment her composure did the thing it almost never did, which was waver, just briefly, at the edges. "I want you to know that it has been the great privilege of my life." He covered her hands with his own, both of them, as he had done that long ago November, and held them against his face and looked at her. "The privilege," he said, "is shared." She leaned forward and kissed him, briefly and warmly, there in the middle of Keating's mercantile with the October light coming through the windows, and Abigail Hayes, who had been straightening bolts of cloth with studied and thoroughgoing inattentiveness in the far corner, made a small sound that she quickly converted into a cough. Eudora stepped back and resumed her professional expression with admirable speed. "I need to finish the inventory," she said. "Yes, you do," James agreed. She picked up her pen and went back to the ledger, and James stayed on the counter and watched the afternoon light move across the shelves of Keating's mercantile. The coffee and the flour and the salt and the hard candy in the glass jar near the register that had migrated from Caldwell's original store. And he thought about October mornings and the quality of a woman's voice and the particular chain of moments that led from one life to another. And he was, in every measurable and immeasurable way, content. The years continued to be good. They were not always easy. The drought years of the early 1890s were hard on everyone in Kansas, and there were seasons when the cattle business required more careful management than others, and there were the ordinary difficulties that life in that era on the frontier produced as a matter of course. James sustained a broken wrist in the spring of 1893 when a young bull made an unexpected decision, and the recovery took 8 weeks, during which time he was instructed by both Eudora and Dr. Ward to do considerably less than he wanted to, and complied with this instruction with imperfect but genuine effort. In the drought of 1894, the kitchen garden failed and the north pasture was reduced to brown stubble by August, and they cut the herd and made careful adjustments and came through it, as they came through all of it together, methodically, without panic. William Keating, at 18 in the year 1898, announced his intention to study law, which Eudora received with the contained but evident delight of a mother who had always suspected this and was glad to be confirmed. James wrote a letter to Aaron Whitfield in Dodge City, who was by now in his 60s and had taken on a young partner, and Whitfield arranged for William to read law in his office, a traditional apprenticeship that suited William's particular combination of practical intelligence and thoroughness. William left for Dodge City in September of that year with his father's handshake and his mother's packed trunk and a copy of Blackstone's commentaries that Eudora had found and ordered through the mercantile. and James watched him ride away on the good bay horse he had been given for his 18th birthday, and felt the specific bittersweet quality of watching something you raised well go out to do what it was raised for. Robert, at 15, was working the cattle with his father and Peter Reeves, and showing every sign of being exactly the cowboy he had always intended to be capable, easy with horses and cattle alike, and possessed of the kind of steady good humor that made long days in difficult conditions bearable for everyone around him. James recognized in Robert qualities of his own younger self: the love of the open country, the satisfaction of physical work well done, and also qualities that were entirely Eudora's, and that manifested in Robert as a genuine care for the people around him, an attentiveness to others' needs that was doing and practical rather than sentimental. Frances, at 10, was attending the Redemption School and had already been identified by her teacher as the most formidable reader and arithmetic student in her class, which was the kind of distinction that pleased both her parents and somewhat alarmed her teacher, who was not entirely prepared for the quality of Frances Keating's questions. On Wednesday evenings, Eudora sat with Frances at the kitchen table and they worked through sums and spelling together, and James, reading the newspaper by the fire, listened to the murmur of their voices. Eudora's patient and precise, Frances's earnest and occasionally incandescent when she understood something new, and thought that this sound was one of the finest sounds he knew. In the spring of 1900, the new century arrived with no particular drama in Redemption, Kansas, which was a town of nearly 1,000 people by then, with 2 churches, 3 saloons, a proper hotel that had replaced the old boarding house, and a bank branch that had opened in 1895 and had Eudora Keating's Mercantile as one of its anchor commercial accounts. Mrs. Hobbs had passed away in 1896, peacefully, at the age of 78, and Eudora had stood at her grave in the Redemption Cemetery and said, without ceremony, that this woman had been one of the better human beings she had encountered, which was the highest compliment in Eudora Chandler Keating's vocabulary. Ruth Parrish, who had also stood at the grave, agreed, and they had walked back from the cemetery together arm in arm. Ruth herself had remarried in 1893, a widowed farmer named Carl Bender who was decent and steady, and who appreciated both Ruth's warmth and her business sense. And the Benders and the Keatings were in the habit of Sunday dinners that rotated between the 2 households, a practice that had been ongoing for several years and showed no signs of stopping. On a Saturday in April of 1900, James and Eudora sat on the front porch of the farmhouse as the spring evening came in across the pasture, the grass new and green, and the sky doing that particular thing it did in spring on the Kansas plains, enormous and clear and faintly lavender at the horizon. They could hear Robert in the barn doing the evening chores, and Frances was somewhere in the kitchen garden, inspecting the new shoots with the seriousness of a person conducting an official inspection. Eudora had a letter from William. He had passed the bar examination in January and was now practicing with Whitfield's partnership in Dodge City. He wrote regularly, and his letters were his mother's letters in miniature, precise, intelligent, occasionally dry, always substantive. He says he is thinking of staying in Dodge City permanently, Eudora said, folding the letter. Is that surprising? James said. No, she said. He belongs there. The city suits him. He does, James agreed. He looked out at the pasture. The cattle were settled for the evening, dark shapes against the green. He is a good man. He is, she said. They both are. She paused, all 3 of them. He looked at her sideways. I had some help with that. We had some help with that, she said, returning his own correction, from each other. The evening continued to deepen across the prairie, and Frances came up from the kitchen garden and reported on the status of the peas and the carrots with the thoroughness of a general reporting on troop positions, and Robert came out of the barn wiping his hands and announced that the mare had a loose shoe that needed seeing to tomorrow, and James said he would look at it in the morning, and they all went inside for supper as the stars began to come in one by one above the Kansas plain. Later, after the children were in their rooms and the house was quiet, Eudora and James sat by the fire in the way they had been sitting by fires together for 21 years, and the familiarity of it was not worn down by repetition but deepened by it, the way a river deepens its own channel over time. "James," Eudora said. "Yes," he said, without looking up from the newspaper. "Are you happy?" He put down the newspaper and looked at her. She was watching him with the steady, clear-eyed attention she brought to everything, but there was a quality of genuine curiosity in it, as though she was asking not because she doubted the answer but because she wanted to hear it said. "More than I knew was possible," he said, "on an October morning in 1878. She nodded slowly, as though this was the correct answer to a question she had been working through carefully. "So am I," she said. She picked up her book. He picked up his newspaper. Outside, the Kansas night was full of stars and silence and the sound of the wind in the grass, and the fire burned in the hearth of the house that had been theirs for 21 years, and it was good. All of it was good, and complete, and real, and theirs. James Keating set down his newspaper a few minutes later and looked across at his wife and thought, not for the first time and not for the last, about a man in a store on an October morning who had heard a woman's voice and had made a choice. He thought about how easy it would have been to keep moving, to pick up his coffee and go, to decide that another person's struggle was not his concern. He thought about how different everything would have been. And then he looked at Eudora, at her face in the firelight, familiar and dear, at the slight movement of her lips as she read, at the way one hand rested in her lap with the comfortable ease of a person at rest in a life they have built. And he was certain, as he had been certain for 21 years, that the best thing he had ever done was simply stay.